In July 1911, the newly crowned British King George V visited Dublin. Thousands turned out to see the royal family's carriage as it paraded down Sackville Street, the main north-south boulevard through central Dublin. Though nobody in the crowd that day could have known, this would be the last royal visit to Dublin for the entire 20th century. A British monarch would not visit the city again until 2011, when Queen Elizabeth II paid a state visit to the capital of the independent Republic of Ireland. By then, Sackville Street had been renamed O'Connell Street, after the 19th century nationalist Daniel O'Connell. The Sackville Street column celebrating Horatio Nelson, the victor at Trafalgar, was also no longer there, having been blown up by nationalists in 1966 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising. Much had changed in the century between these two royal visits. The security for Elizabeth's visit reflected the anxieties produced by decades of conflict, with checkpoints placed on each block along O'Connell Street. In 1911, there were crowds of Union Jack waving Dubliners all along the parade route, but in 2011 there were no crowds at all. The streets were completely cleared when Elizabeth traveled from place to place. A group calling itself the Real IRA had threatened to assassinate the Queen, and the British security services had recently foiled the group's attempt to buy a rocket-propelled grenade on the black market. The Queen had come to lay a wreath at Croke Park, the site of a massacre in 1920, and visited the memorial to the Irish War of Independence, the Garden of Remembrance. There were protests in advance of her visit, with nationalists carrying signs denouncing what they saw as the continued occupation of Northern Ireland. There was one way in which the two royal visits were similar, however. George V's parade in Dublin went off without a hitch, and so too did Queen Elizabeth's visit. The Irish press fixated not on the protests, but on the fact that Prince Philip wasn't served a pint of Guinness at the Guinness factory. Royal protocol dictates that the Queen must be served before anyone else, and when she was offered a pint at the Gravity Bar, she politely smiled and walked away. Prince Philip stood at the bar for several minutes with what the press called obvious longing, but wasn't served one, because the Queen declined hers. George V's visit in 1911 was not without its protests. The Dublin trade unionist and future Easter Rising leader James Connolly was aghast at the crowds that turned out to see the royal family. He denounced, quote, all these parading royalties, all this incessant aristocracy, all these groveling, dirt-eating capitalist traders, all these are but signs of disease in any social state, diseases which a royal visit brings to a head and spews in all its nastiness before our horrified eyes. He spoke for a determined few, and it's important to emphasize that it really was a determined few. Most Irish people in 1911 did not want full independence. They yearned instead for greater autonomy within the British Empire. Irish politics was dominated by the Irish Parliamentary Party, which demanded home rule for Ireland, by which they meant the entire island, including the Protestants of the North. Some 210,000 Irishmen enlisted in the British Army during World War I, of whom about 35,000 never came home. This was a much larger number than fought in the War of Independence a few years later. To understand how the Irish people would come to support the nationalist cause, we need to take a close look at the tumultuous events of the second decade of the 20th century. And to do that, we need to take a step back and look at Ireland's place within the British Empire. We last discussed Ireland when we covered the Battle of the Boyne, the victory, still celebrated by Protestants in the north, of the Protestant William of Orange over the deposed Catholic James II. James's Irish Jacobite army fought on for another year, surrendering in October 1691. The ensuing Treaty of Limerick allowed the Jacobite army to go to France, where its Irish units were organized as regiments in the French army. This came to be known as the Flight of the Wild Geese, and for generations, Irish men of military age would serve with distinction on the continent. The Treaty of Limerick also included provisions for those who remained, guaranteeing the property of any Irishman who swore allegiance to William and Mary. It also guaranteed freedom of worship to Catholics. Unlike the military articles, the ones allowing the Jacobites to leave for France, the provisions guaranteeing property were broken almost immediately. Irish Catholic landowners lost most of their remaining land, and by 1703 Catholics owned only 14% of the land in Ireland. This 14% was concentrated in Connaught, the far western part of the island with the poorest soil. The other 86% was owned by Protestants, who accounted for no more than about 10% of the population. This began the period that came to be known as the Protestant Ascendancy, the rise of an elite class of Protestant landowners who built sprawling estates and lorded over Catholic tenants. Some of the most important British figures of the 18th and 19th century were in fact Anglo-Irish, from the philosopher Edmund Burke to the Duke of Wellington, the victor at Waterloo. We think of them as British, and by the 19th century at least, so did they. The Duke of Wellington was born in Dublin but never thought of himself as Irish. He famously said that being born in a stable does not make you a horse. The principal divisions in Ireland were religious. Until 1829, Catholics could neither vote nor sit in Parliament. Ireland possessed its own Parliament, entirely Protestant of course, until 1800, when it voted in an act of union to dissolve itself and merge with Britain. Its powers were limited. Ireland was recognized in British law as a separate kingdom but not an equal one. As far back as 1494, the English government had passed what was called Poynings Law, which stipulated that any law passed by the Irish Parliament would also have to be approved by the English one. This aroused little opposition at the time. After all, in 1494, the Irish Parliament only governed the Pale. It also aroused little opposition during the 16th and 17th centuries. Irish Protestants were too weak and too dependent on England to complain about a self-limiting provision like this. But by the middle of the 18th century, Ireland was at peace. The settlement of 1691 appeared to have been final. Irish Catholics were so thoroughly defeated that they took no part in the Jacobite risings in Scotland in 1715 and 1745. The Protestant interest in Ireland seemed both strong and eternal, and when American colonists began groaning about taxation without representation during the 1760s, Irish Protestants began noticing the restrictions embedded in Poynings Law. A group calling itself the Patriot Party emerged, led by Henry Grattan, which pushed for the legislative independence of Ireland. It did not push for total separation. Grattan advocated retaining the British monarchy and a common military. When the American Revolution did break out, Grattan used the distraction to agitate for reform, and the same Whigs who were sympathetic to the American cause were sympathetic to the Irish one. In 1782, he achieved his ambition. The British Parliament repealed Poynings Law and granted Ireland full home rule. As a gesture of continued loyalty, Grattan celebrated by steering a bill through the Irish Parliament that provided Ireland was now an equal kingdom to England, but there was very little equality within Ireland. Catholics were still excluded, and the Protestant ascendancy still controlled an overwhelming share of Irish land. Grattan himself recognized the irony and pushed for Catholic emancipation, a repeal of the penal laws that deprived them of the franchise. But land reform was out of the question. So too was the disestablishment of the Anglican Church in Ireland. All Irishmen, whether Catholic, Anglican, or Presbyterian, were taxed to support a church that attracted only a tiny sliver of the population. These issues alienated a new generation of Irishmen, both Catholic and Protestant, who after 1789 looked to the unfolding revolution in France as an example. A group of mostly Presbyterian liberals formed a group that called itself the Society of United Irishmen. It campaigned for the creation of an Irish republic, with no monarchy or aristocracy and with equal rights for all. This necessarily entailed breaking the connection with England, by force if necessary. The United Irishmen were led by a man named Wolfe Tone, a young Anglican who pressed for the abolition of penal laws against Catholics. With Britain and France at war, Tone thought that the French would be duty-bound to back a nationalist uprising in Ireland, and the combined Franco-Irish force just might have a fighting chance against the British. This once more demonstrated the national security conundrum presented by Ireland, and its potential to serve as a backdoor to Britain's enemies. In the spring of 1798, the United Irishmen rebelled, with tens of thousands of young men joining local units that rapidly took over large swaths of the country. The French dispatched an expeditionary force to back the rebels, but any hope of a united nationalist front was quashed by realities on the ground. There was little communication between the rebel forces, leading to a series of localized risings that were snuffed out when the British sent troops under the command of Lord Cornwallis to restore order. Most importantly, the conflict rapidly descended into sectarian violence as Catholics sought vengeance against Protestants for over a century of suffering. Massacres of Protestant civilians fueled retaliatory violence against Catholics, effectively dooming any attempt to create a broad nationalist coalition. Protestant support for the uprising evaporated. The subsequent British victory demonstrated that Irish Protestants needed British help to survive in a land otherwise hostile to them. When the British government proposed an act of union with Ireland, which would dissolve the Irish Parliament and merge Ireland into the United Kingdom, Irish Protestants leapt at the opportunity. The link between Protestantism and Unionism had been set. For the mass of Catholic peasants, the Act of Union replaced an unaccountable Irish Parliament with an unaccountable British one. Catholics still lacked the right to vote, despite having been promised by William Pitt that a Catholic Emancipation Bill would be soon in coming. Pitt hoped that by combining union and emancipation, he would solve two basic problems. He could mollify Catholic activists by removing formal religious discrimination, while also ensuring that Catholics would not actually be able to dominate Ireland and seek revenge on Protestants. Catholics certainly formed a majority of the Irish population, but they were still a minority within the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which could be safely governed by Protestants. But George III vetoed the Emancipation Bill, and Catholics would not gain the franchise until 1829. Compounding Ireland's woes in these years was a looming demographic disaster. The Irish population more than doubled between 1800 and 1840, jumping from around 4 million to about 8.5 million. By contrast, Ireland's population in 2020 is only 6.6 million, a figure that includes the North as well as the South. This demographic boom was fueled by the introduction of the potato, a North American crop that could thrive even in the poor soil of Connaught. It was incredibly nutritious. Even if you ate nothing else, the potato could provide you with enough nutrients to survive. For the poorest Irish peasants, though, this was a double-edged sword. Because the potato provided a higher yield per acre than most other crops, many of Ireland's most destitute tenant farmers planted only potatoes. This was sustainable only as long as each year's harvest was as good as the last, but in 1845, a potato blight caused the crop to fail. This blight killed about a third of the crop in 1845, but the following year it carried off 2/3. A partial recovery did not occur until 1848, but even then, only 2/3 of the normal crop were viable. The impact of what became known as the Great Potato Famine was devastating. Between 1 and 1.5 million Irish died between 1845 and 1851, either of starvation or of diseases associated with it. A further 1.5 million emigrated, mostly to the United States, though some went to Britain or to Canada. The government's response was half-hearted at best. The British government opened soup kitchens and created public works programs, though both initiatives were chronically underfunded and lasted only a few months. This partially reflected the economic orthodoxies of the day. Britons of both parties prided themselves on limited government and a laissez-faire approach to the market. Even government investment in a sewer system was thought to encroach upon personal freedoms. It was also an era that brought into the grim demographic prophecies of Thomas Malthus, who argued that population would always outstrip the available food supply. Increases in population, like the one Ireland experienced owing to the potato, would be naturally checked by events like the potato famine, killing off the surplus population and bringing it to more sustainable levels. To Malthus and his readers, this was as natural as the air we breathe, and it was better for the government to simply step aside and let nature do its work. For those of you familiar with Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, You can see a glimpse of this attitude when Ebenezer Scrooge tells the ghost of Christmas Present that if Tiny Tim is to die, he better do it and decrease the surplus population. In the end, Tiny Tim did not die, but around 1 to 1.5 million Irish did. The Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, Sir Charles Trevelyan, remarked that, quote, the problem of Irish overpopulation being altogether beyond the power of man, the cure had been supplied by the direct stroke of an all-wise Providence. He and others warned that if the government provided too much famine relief, it would induce in the Irish a fatal dependence on government subsidy, while doing no more than delaying the inevitable demographic collapse. Moreover, the government must not interfere with private trade in any way. So when Irish landlords exported beef, mutton, and other meat to England, it was imperative that this trade be allowed to proceed and that this food must not be distributed to the hungry Irish. This prompted food riots in Cork, Yarmouth, and other cities. The famine was both a natural disaster in the form of the Blight and an invented one in the form of British policy. Economic orthodoxies did drive the British response, but so too did anti-Irish prejudice. The Irish were thought to be poor, backward, and effectively starving anyway, not worth the handouts that would be provided by hard-working Protestant Englishmen. This was perhaps the largest factor in preventing relief. The same potato blight affected the crop in Scotland, devastating large swaths of the Highlands, but there was no famine there. Highland landlords, feeling a sense of responsibility for their tenants, borrowed large sums of money to import food and open soup kitchens. Anglo-Irish landlords, divided from their tenants by language, religion, and culture, generally did no such thing. The Great Potato Famine had several long-term ramifications for Ireland and its place in the empire. The immigration of more than 1 million people, replenished by a near constant outflow well into the 20th century, created an Irish diaspora that was often incredibly nationalist in outlook. These immigrants, often referring to themselves as the exiles of Erin, felt that they had been forcibly pushed out of their homeland by the murderous British. It was the Irish diaspora, particularly the Irish diaspora in America, that largely funded the nationalist movement within Ireland. It was Irish Americans that would provide a refuge for rebels on the run and would eventually buy guns for the Irish Republican Army. This persisted well into the 1990s. Many nationalist activists would spend time in America. Some, like the longtime president of Ireland, Eamon de Valera, would be born there. The fact that de Valera was born in the United States and thus possessed American citizenship prevented his execution in 1916, when all the other leaders of the Easter Rising faced the firing squad. The impact of American exile and Irish nationalism can be seen almost immediately. About 200,000 Irish immigrants fought during the Civil War, about 150,000 on the Union side and about 50,000 on the Confederate. This provided much needed military experience, and in 1864, a Union Irish general by the name of Fighting Tom Sweeney approached a Confederate Irish officer, John O'Sullivan, with an offer of truce outside Atlanta. Fighting Tom Sweeney had been wounded in every engagement except one, hence the nickname, and in fact, Ulysses S. Grant had once told him that he didn't believe he had even been at the battle he hadn't been wounded in, because there was no evidence for it in the form of a wound. Sweeney proposed to O'Sullivan that their two regiments not fight each other for the rest of the conflict, since their real battle was with England. After the war, they could gather together Irish veterans from both sides and invade Canada, which they would conquer and hold as a hostage in exchange for Irish independence. O'Sullivan thought this was a great idea, and he and other like-minded officers organized themselves into what became known as the Fenian Brotherhood. The Fenian Brotherhood, which took its name from Fianna, or the legendary warriors led by Fionn McCumall, had been founded a couple years earlier in 1858, but it received a new lease on life in 1865 by Irish veterans with a lot of military experience and a lot of boredom now that the Civil War was over. This can be seen in the Fenian Soldier Song of 1866. Invade Canada they did. Thousands of Fenian soldiers crossed the border in the spring of 1866, having been organized into 3 columns that would seize the cities of Toronto and Montreal. They routed a British force at the Battle of Ridgeway, near Fort Erie in Ontario on June 2, 1866, and appeared to be on the cusp of victory. The U.S. government, eager to annoy the British for their pro-Confederate sympathies during the Civil War, did nothing to stop the Irish troops from organizing on American soil. But in the aftermath of Ridgeway, the British government threatened war if the U.S. did not immediately close the border, which it did. Deprived of their supply lines, the Fenians retreated back to America. Fightin' Tom Sweeney was arrested for having violated U.S. neutrality laws for leading the invasion. He was soon released and honored with a parade in Philadelphia. Still, Ireland remained within the British Empire. The Fenian invasion of Canada had been accompanied by a small rebellion in Ireland as well, easily crushed by the British Army. This then morphed into a low-level campaign of intimidation against Anglo-Irish landlords, the ones who had been so eager to do nothing during the potato famine. Irish tenants sought security of tenure. There was nothing in British law that could prevent them from being thrown off their lands at the conclusion of their lease, with most leases being no more than 1 year in length. This discouraged innovation and investment in improving the soil, since the tenant had no incentive to invest in the soil in October when he could lose his holding in November. Irish landlords had begun to take an interest in sheep rearing, replacing small-scale tenant farmers with herds of sheep that could command a good price if exported. As a result, the Fenian Brotherhood organized boycotts, the term itself actually derives from this period, whereby tenants refused to pay rent unless granted tenure, basically a tenancy for life. If landlords tried to force the tenants off the soil, the Fenians would kill them. This was all part of what became known as the Irish Land War, and it, unlike the Great Potato Famine, prompted a vigorous British response. The Liberal Prime Minister at the time, William Gladstone, was sympathetic to Irish grievances and responded with a program that would allow Irish tenants to buy their lands with government assistance. It also established land courts that were meant to guarantee fair terms for tenants, including tenure and life rents, should they decline to purchase their lands. Gladstone made it his mission to achieve what he referred to as justice for Ireland. His ally in this fight was the great Irish MP Charles Stewart Parnell, the Protestant leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Both sought a partial repeal of the Act of Union and the granting of Home Rule for Ireland. Home Rule in this instance was fairly limited. It would create a legislature in Dublin that would control some domestic matters, but foreign, military, and economic policy would remain in London's control. Gladstone thought this to be a sensible policy that would satisfy nationalist ambitions while preserving the integrity of the British Empire. It was not to be. Gladstone introduced the first Home Rule bill in April 1886, but it was defeated in the House of Commons by 311 votes for and 341 against. The bill triggered a revolt in Gladstone's own party, with a group of angry liberals storming off to create the Liberal Unionist Party that would eventually merge with the Conservatives. It provoked ferocious opposition among Protestants in Northern Ireland, who concluded that Home Rule meant that they would be ruled by Catholics, fears reflected in the slogan, "Home Rule is Rome Rule." Gladstone governed in coalition with the Irish Parliamentary Party, and the collapse of the bill triggered a collapse in the government itself. A liberal unionist and conservative government came to power in the subsequent election, which put Home Rule on the back burner for the time being. Charles Stewart Parnell had campaigned vigorously for the bill, warning of violent consequences if it was not passed, but he too fell from power, forced to resign his leadership of the Irish Parliamentary Party after a sex scandal. Although Gladstone would introduce another Home Rule bill during the 1890s, the issue would not return to the forefront until the early years of the 20th century. In the meantime, with Ireland's political ambitions dashed, a nationalist cultural revival swept the country. This was referred to as the Gaelic Revival, and it saw a huge revitalization of interest in the Gaelic language, which had been disappearing since Britain's conquest of Ireland in the early modern period, as well as Gaelic poetry, Gaelic football, and Gaelic folklore. The Gaelic revival would have a major impact on the subsequent War of Independence, whose leaders imagined themselves to be reenacting scenes from Ireland's mythic past. The Easter rebels were obsessed with the story of Cuchulainn, a mythological hero who died in battle facing impossible odds. The monument to the Easter Rising itself, placed in the General Post Office in Dublin, is actually a statue of Cuchulainn. Patrick Pearse, the leader of the Rising, founded a Gaelic-only school for boys in which he extolled the virtues of Ireland's heroes and challenged the new generation to live up to this ideal. When Home Rule returned to the forefront of British politics in the early years of the 20th century, it presented British and Irish politicians with a host of bad options. The Liberals had won the election of 1906 in a landslide, but when they lost a large share of their seats in an election 4 years later, in 1910, they could remain in power only if they governed in coalition with the Irish Parliamentary Party, the IPP. The IPP, which controlled 74 seats, demanded Home Rule as the price for entering into this coalition. The Liberals agreed, and in 1911 an Irish Home Rule bill passed the House of Commons, only to fail in the House of Lords. This was seen by Home Rule supporters as unacceptably undemocratic. The House of Lords was controlled by unelected Conservative peers who Home Rule supporters believed had no right to squelch the will of the people. Many called for the abolition of the House of Lords altogether. The IPP demanded that the Liberals pass a bill that would limit the power of this unelected upper house, which it did, and which predictably also failed in the House of Lords. With protests engulfing both Ireland and Britain, King George V sought to resolve the controversy by threatening to create new peers, which was his right as king, who would vote for abolition if the House of Lords did not accept a watered-down version of the Commons Bill, which would replace the Lords' veto over legislation with a 3-year delay. If the House of Lords voted against the law passed by the Commons, it would still become law, but in 3 years. The Commons duly passed the Home Rule Bill, and the Lords voted to delay. On this schedule, the Home Rule Bill will become law in 1914. What could go wrong? Quite a lot, it seemed. The 3-year delay gave Home Rule opponents in Northern Ireland time to organize. Ulster Unionists, led this time by a Protestant agitator from Dublin, Sir Edward Carson, denounced Home Rule as the beginnings of Catholic tyranny. He insisted, like his forebears from 1886, that Home Rule was Rome Rule and insisted that neither he nor any other Protestant would accept it, regardless of whether it became law or not. In 1912, Carson and his supporters signed the Ulster Covenant, which pledged its signatories to resist Home Rule by force if necessary. Some signatories actually signed the covenant in their own blood. To make good on this threat, the Ulster Unionists raised a militia of 100,000 men, dubbed the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, that declared that it would fight any attempt by the British Army to enforce Home Rule. This raised the awkward specter of fighting a nation's army for the privilege of remaining in that nation. This was anathema to senior figures within the British Army, including the Commander-in-Chief, Sir Henry Wilson, who declared that if his government ever ordered him to open fire on the UVF, he would refuse the order. Given this reality, some Irish nationalists came to realize that Home Rule was probably never going to happen. The IPP authorized the creation of its own paramilitary force, the Irish Volunteers, that if necessary would do what the British Army would not, force Ulster Unionists to accept Home Rule. 160,000 men enlisted. Everybody waited to see what would happen when Home Rule became law, as it was scheduled to do on September 18, 1914. But then World War I intervened. When Britain declared war on Germany that August, Britain's anxious cabinet breathed a slight sigh of relief. The Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, said that at least they didn't have to worry about Ireland anymore. Parliament suspended Home Rule for the duration of the conflict. Ireland was caught up in the same enthusiasm for war as the rest of Europe, at least at first. John Redmond, the leader of the IPP, urged young men to volunteer for the British Army, and tens of thousands of existing Irish volunteers did exactly that. Unlike the UVF, however, Irish volunteers were not allowed to retain their unit and command structure upon joining the British Army, and were instead organized into existing British regiments. A group of about 10,000 Irish volunteers declared their neutrality and refused to serve in the British Army, insisting that they served neither king nor Kaiser but Ireland. This group included many who would form the nucleus of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, and counted among their number Eamon de Valera, Michael Collins, and Daniel Breen. As the First World War ground to a stalemate, the radical wing of the nationalist movement began to sense an opportunity. British forces were bogged down in France, and if Ireland were to rebel now, it could seize the initiative and perhaps even win German help before Britain could adequately respond. Radicals like Patrick Pearse and Thomas Clark knew that violent rebellion would be unpopular, and that any initial action would be crushed, but they hoped that if they made a heroic stand against the British, the Irish people would awaken and rise up against their oppressors. On Easter Monday, 1916, about 2,000 radicals seized control of central Dublin and declared from the steps of the General Post Office the independence of the Irish Republic. This republic lasted about a week before it was suppressed, and its leaders, with the exception of Eamon de Valera, were promptly shot by firing squad. Like Pearse and Clark had predicted, the rebellion was unpopular. Defeated rebels were actually shouted at by crowds as they were taken to prison camps. But the summary execution of the nationalist leadership began to shift public opinion. Most of the rank and file were released from captivity after only a few months, and with Sinn Féin, a radical political party whose name means we ourselves, began campaigning for the creation of an independent Irish republic. This was to be accomplished by a policy of absenteeism, whereby any Sinn Féin MP elected to Parliament would refuse to take up their seat and would instead gather in a national parliament in Dublin to be called Dáil Éireann. Public opinion had shifted so decisively that in the elections of 1918, Sinn Féin won 73 seats out of a possible 105, a democratic mandate for absenteeism and the creation of an Irish republic. Sinn Féin MPs gathered in Dublin to form Dáil Éireann, which informally recognized the Irish Republican Army as its military force. The British government declared the assembly illegal, and on the same day as the opening of the Dáil, the first shots of what became known as the Irish War of Independence were fired when Daniel Breen ambushed a column of the Royal Irish Constabulary. Led by Michael Collins, a young Easter Rising veteran who preferred ambushes and assassinations to full-scale battles, the IRA would fight the British Army to a stalemate. Collins sought to devastate Britain's intelligence network in Ireland, using targeted assassinations to eliminate British officials with any knowledge of the IRA's activities. He was so successful at this that nobody within the British government actually knew what he looked like, since nobody had managed to acquire a photo of him. At one point, Collins actually walked into British intelligence headquarters in a three-piece suit, and using an alias, went to the library and archive and smuggled out all of the files about himself and many of his men. To exploit the element of surprise, Collins organized the IRA into flying columns that would ambush British units and disappear into the countryside. The British government found it difficult to respond to these attacks, and since the British Army had largely demobilized in the wake of World War I, the government turned to an auxiliary force of mostly unemployed war veterans who were recruited back into the army and given a special uniform that combined British khaki with the dark green worn by the Royal Irish Constabulary. Since the dark green was so dark that it looked like it was black, these men came to be called the Black and Tans. Shell-shocked in many cases from their experience in the trenches of the First World War, and having been unable to put down any post-war roots, the Black and Tans were just about the worst group to deal with an insurgency. They responded to ambushes by shooting civilians at random, taking hostages, and torturing IRA prisoners. On the 21st of November 1920, after Michael Collins had 16 intelligence agents shot in a single day, the Black and Tans sought vengeance on the civilian population of Dublin. They sent armored cars into Croke Park, the Gaelic football stadium, to fire on the crowds who had gathered there for a game between Dublin City and Tipperary. In what became known as Bloody Sunday, the first but not the last time this moniker would be used to describe events in Ireland, the Black and Tans killed at least 14 people and wounded another 60. Bloody Sunday was met with outrage both in Ireland and in Britain. Those Irish still on the fence moved to support independence, while many in Britain deplored the atrocities being committed in their name. The Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, sent peace feelers to the IRA to ask for an armistice, which would then be followed by negotiations for a permanent treaty. Eamon de Valera dispatched Michael Collins to lead the Irish negotiating team. The two sides agreed to an Anglo-Irish treaty on December 6, 1921, that simultaneously achieved more than home rule but less than full independence. It authorized the creation of an Irish Free State that would have full control over domestic and economic policy, but would remain part of the British Empire as a dominion, with the same status as Canada or Australia. It allowed the 6 Protestant-dominated counties of Northern Ireland to opt out of the Free State and remain part of the United Kingdom. It also required every member of the Dáil to swear allegiance to the Crown. It was this latter provision, and not the one allowing the North to secede, that aroused the most opposition in Ireland. Opponents of the treaty complained that they had bled for an Irish republic only to declare allegiance to a foreign king. Michael Collins insisted that he hated the treaty, but it was the best he could do, and he argued that it gave the Irish the freedom to achieve freedom, to use their control over the Free State to build their strength and gain full independence later. Unfortunately, Eamon de Valera disavowed the treaty and condemned Michael Collins for having agreed to it. Although the treaty was ratified by the Dáil and endorsed by overwhelming margins in a national referendum, a radical faction of treaty opponents refused to accept it, and like the Easter rebels in 1916, took over much of central Dublin in protest. This time they made the Four Courts building, Ireland's Supreme Court, their headquarters. They hoped to bait the British into attacking them, which would then cause the pro-treaty side to tear up the treaty and come to their rescue. But Michael Collins and others saw this as a test of Irish independence, whether the Free State, which now had its own army, could police its own territory. The IRA had split in two, the pro-treaty side joining the Free State Army, and the anti-treaty side pledging, as de Valera put it, that if we need to wade through Irish blood to win our independence, then so be it. Michael Collins reluctantly opened fire on his former comrades on June 18, 1922, beginning an Irish civil war that would last for 9 months and result in more casualties than the initial War of Independence. It would result in a victory for the pro-treaty side, where the division still cleaves Irish politics. The two largest parties for much of the 20th century, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, are descended from the pro- and anti-treaty side of the Civil War. De Valera, who would come to regret not having supported the treaty, led Fianna Fáil to victory in the 1932 elections, and would simply ignore the parts of the treaty he didn't like. He refused to swear allegiance to the British Crown upon his election to the Dáil, and dared the British government to do something about it, which of course they didn't. He pushed through a new constitution in 1937, and kept Ireland neutral during World War II, though he sympathized privately with the Allies. In 1949, Ireland left the British Commonwealth and severed all political connections with the United Kingdom. Michael Collins was not around this time to see it. As the Anglo-Irish Treaty was being signed, a British minister, worried about the potential political fallout in England, joked that he had just signed his death warrant. Michael Collins, with a puzzled look on his face, responded by saying that he had signed his actual death warrant. He was right. On August 22, 1922, in the midst of the Irish Civil War, the anti-treaty IRA assassinated Michael Collins while he was on his way home from Cork. He was just 31 years old. 1/5 of the Irish population attended his funeral in Dublin, where he laid in state for 3 days. He, and not De Valera, remains Ireland's hero of the War of Independence.